So welcome everyone. It's really a pleasure to see you all. I'm Jonathan Pershing. I'm the inaugural dean for the new Global School of Sustainability here at LSE. And among other things, this is the first time I get to say anything in public at the school. And it's really an honor to do it here with really such an illustrious community. When Nicola asked if I would take this on and I said yes, I thought to myself, is that wise? And then I thought to myself, well, the answer is you couldn't be at a better place with a more important agenda to speak to, or one that's more central to the sustainability dialogue that we're hoping to launch with the new school. So it really is a pleasure to come and to have a chance both to introduce the panel and the group, and then maybe I'll say a few words at the end as well in wrapping. I wanted to say just a few things about the topic before I turn the floor over to Gretchen, and I'll introduce Gretchen and Nicola in just a moment. I want to say a few words about the topic. I've spent my career thinking a lot about the role of government in the sustainability agenda. And for a great deal of that time, we've had a few issues that really have risen to the top of the political priority list. In particular, the issues of climate change, which have preoccupied people, and certainly I've been preoccupied with for many, many decades now. But we tend to lose in that some of the other elements of the sustainability agenda that are no less important and no less significant to the welfare, not of the planet only, which is kind of an ecosystem frame, but of the people who live in it, and how we interact with it. And in some ways, this panel is going to speak to those interactions, those questions of how biodiversity and nature, which are often assumed or taken for granted, actually have a fundamental consequence to how we live, how our children live, how our futures look, the prosperity of our world, and where it takes us. One of the things that I find interesting, and one of the reasons that I came to LSE, was because of the diversity of approaches that we take to the social sciences. So we're not only an institution that has an extraordinary economics faculty, we're not only an institution that thinks about political issues and has a school of international relations, we're also a place that thinks about psychology and human choice. We're a place that thinks about society and how systems and communities evolve and develop. We're people who think a lot about the interactions between the physical parameters of our world and the economic and social dimensions that we create that shape those parameters. Because make no mistake, the choices that we make in our political systems, in our social systems, have a direct and consequential effect on the physical systems. And those physical systems are under threat. We cannot look forward and assume that the past is the predictor of the future. It isn't. We've changed it. We've changed it in ways that we can still reverse, but the trajectories that we are on have enormous salience. They have salience to the fact that if you live in a place like Cape Town, you ran out of water a couple of years ago. There are in places like California, where Gretchen comes from and where I've just moved from, where the wildfires have increased to the point where you no longer have guaranteed electricity in a state like California, which is remarkably advanced. You have consequences in places like India, where the number of heat deaths this past summer have outweighed the capacity of any medical system to manage them. These are physical changes led by decisions that we've made in our social systems. So they all make a difference. The converse is also true. Things that protect us in our ecosystems are ways to help manage those physical risks. If we look at the mangroves around much of Southeast Asia, they've protected us for generations from hurricanes and typhoons. If we think about the structure of how I do recharge in aquifers, they create safe drinking water around the world. These are things that are services that we'll also hear about and speak about today. So it's an honor to be here, and let me start off by introducing our first speaker. And we'll have a process here with Gretchen speaking. We'll then have, after that, a panel that Nicola will lead with some really eminent guests whom she will introduce. We'll have a chance after that for some questions from you all in the audience, and then we'll conclude. So that's the program that we've got for the evening. So let me first start off by introducing Gretchen Daily. She is currently at Stanford University. She is the co-founder and faculty director of the Stanford Natural Capital Alliance. This is an organization that was launched already 20 years ago in 2005 with a number of other university partners, currently numbering more than 100, really quite a large organization. And she's got tools and approaches that are being used globally to think about the management of how we consider ecosystem services and some of their impacts. She's run and developed a program called Invest, which is a set of tools that help decision makers look at these natural capital elements and think how to apply them in their decision making. So these are not just theoretical structures, they're practical, applicable tools that can be used by decision makers across the spectrum, from governments to banks to local decision makers. She's also the director of the Center for Conservation Biology at Stanford and a senior fellow at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. So with that, Gretchen, let me turn the floor to you.
Thank you. Oh, wow. I want to be able to see everybody. Good evening. I'm so grateful for the chance to meet together this evening, and I imagine you've all come in from different places, some of you from far. Maybe I'd better not touch this, but some friends are right below. So, I really appreciate your spending the evening here and hopefully helping all of us advance our thinking on where to head in pursuit of human well-being, of economic prosperity, ideas of growth, and also securing a future. We're all a little bit worried, or I don't think we'd be in here, about the future and what we can possibly do. And what I'd like to do is weave an arc through some stories that mark out a path and a way of coming together with many others to do a lot more than what one can do alone. It's a time when, especially with all the exciting advances here in the UK generally, and especially at the LSE, and among the partners here this evening, the Grantham Research Institute and the whole new School of Sustainability, we have tremendous capacity, and this is our chance, this is our shot to integrate our different skills, our perspectives, like Jonathan was saying, coming from many different backgrounds and seeing the problem from many different angles. So I want to thank you for that, and I'll kick off first in a place, just so you know where we are. We'll weave through Costa Rica a bit, where I've worked for over 30 years now, and one of the most inspiring countries I've ever visited. And also, I'll go back to when I was a graduate student. I was very fortunate to get introduced to the Bayer Institute. How many of you know of the Bayer Institute? I'm just kind of curious for who's in the room. Over in the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. I got to know Partha there, actually a little before that, when he visited at Stanford for a year or two on sabbatical. And I got to know many other really inspiring economists, like his close collaborator, Carl-Johan Mailer, Ken Arrow, who inspired so many, the Nobel Prize in Economics, and tremendous support for making the shift that we need to make. And I start back here partly just to remind us that everything does take time. We don't really have time, but things do take time, and we have come a long way with the tremendous foundation that started being laid down. I know I'm arbitrarily picking this moment, but it was a key moment to bring together different disciplines in a new set of ways. And from there, what I'd like to do is relate some of the arc and then invite us all into a conversation and maybe, following up on what we can do together to go much farther. But not long after the academics got together, some very noticeable pioneering efforts were launched in different parts of the world. One of them in Costa Rica. If you're familiar with this area, you'll know what it was. If you're not, maybe you have no idea. Costa Rica, up until the early 90s, was seen as a poster child of planetary destruction. had the highest deforestation rate in the tropics and worldwide ever recorded at a national scale, at a scale bigger than just around a lumber mill. And then it got some remarkable leaders who designed and implemented a payment system that paid about $50 US per hectare per year to any landholder who agreed to just let the forest stay or grow back. It had a few more dimensions to it than that, but it was focused basically on the idea, the understanding brought by several very well-trained political leaders at the time, including Alvaro Umana, with a background in economics and hydrology, that the energy security of the country, mostly coming from hydropower, depended critically on forest, which serves as a sponge, soaks up the really heavy rain, and releases it gradually around the year when people need it, rather than in flash floods, as was happening in other countries that were also badly deforested and continues to happen in parts of Costa Rica. But that system, along with some other changes in policy and governance, has really transformed not just Costa Rica. They had gone down to, from pretty much full forest cover since, let's say, the 1800s or so, to maybe 25% forest cover, a really dramatic loss. They're back up almost to 60% now and trying to figure out what an optimum might be to balance with food security and other needs as well. But that contributed the first big steps toward recognizing forest carbon offsets, and many other laid a foundation for many other policy advances that Costa Rica started brokering with European partners and others around the world. At the same time, amazingly enough, New York City also jumped into a step that nobody thought anybody would take in the US. We had implemented water treatment plants all over the country to deal with drinking water, but they were suddenly being overwhelmed by new pathogens like Giardia and Cryptosporidium. Even in small storms, those pathogens could get out and had killed over 100 people in one incident in Milwaukee. And there were other problems, a lot of discontent among people living in the upper parts of that watershed, about 100 miles to the north of the city. So the city proposed, in dealing with its more and more polluted drinking water, to pay upstream people to shift practices, not replant entirely, but actually just adjust practices. Like this farmer here, dairy producer, uses this solar tent now rather than the old and beautiful but dank and dark barn that keeps his cows much healthier. So little things, it wasn't rocket science, but it was getting people together and actually rewarding stewardship. And the city continues with this. It's never had to build a treatment plant that was estimated to cost $6 to $8 billion with only a 10-year operating horizon and so on. And for about $1.5 billion, they've really secured the watershed that's written about in the New York Times many times a year. There have been recent articles. If you're interested, it's still underway. And the biggest of the pioneering three, I'd say back then, was China. China had experienced a few years before, actually it was 1998, biblical scale flooding and devastating consequences for people, for livelihoods, for major cities, for huge agricultural regions. And with tremendous science in their government, looked to the scientists and engineers for the causes and possible solutions, and implemented the biggest payment for ecosystem services program in the world that has many names. One is the Sloping Land Conversion Program, and it takes these steep slopes that you see here and offers people payment to stop growing annual crops on them, basically, and convert them to deeply rooted trees and vegetation that will help prevent the type of flooding that was the cause back then. And all these programs continue today. and are seen as absolutely foundational in bringing science together with policy, together with stewardship. You don't get to the actual stewardship of people changing what they're doing on land and restoring and revitalizing nature. You won't actually get anywhere. You're only going a little ways. So all are doing this, and the big question was, could we, based on those experiences, try to systematize a universal approach, or at least an approach that would work over much of the world? And that's when the idea came up among a bunch of friends to co-found the Natural Capital Project, to bring together academic institutions with a lot of implementing partners in a way that's become much more commonplace today, but is still a rough road in a lot of academic contexts. Get people out in the real world and actually see what's going on, work together hand in hand to innovate. And the innovation is so through partnership of all types, through all kinds of technology, sensing what's going on in the world and making sense of it in models and other tools to aid decision makers, who are the main focus, but ultimately leading to stewardship, to revitalizing. So I'm not going to go through it in much detail, but I want to raise the question, where should we be going next? How can I'll lay out some of the arc of impact, and then have everybody thinking, though, how can we actually scale to a meaningful level that really helps us turn around the many unbelievable trends that threaten our well-being and those of all of our descendants in nature, of which we're an intimate part, and in human society. So we set up demonstration sites. That was number one, with partners, find willing partners. Initially we were teased for being really cheap dates, but we were keen just to work with anybody and really start understanding different systems and how we could devise approaches, see what worked, and maybe try to replicate and scale up successful bets. So we worked in a variety of different areas: development planning, livable cities, coastal climate resilience, a lot of risk reduction, securing water, food, and other things, and a little in private sector standards and investment. We worked a ton with people from lots of different countries. This is a group from Uruguay. This is a former president of Costa Rica. To the right, an indigenous Native Hawaiian group. At the bottom, one of our symposia, to which all are welcome. The next one is starting on the 29th of June. It's easy to register on the website. There's still some opening for introducing major sessions if you'd like, or come as an individual, and a lot takes place there at Stanford, California, if you're willing to fly to the US. Together, we designed some tools that Jonathan alluded to, Invest, for integrated valuation. So we're trying to get right at the economic value. What is the value proposition, the growth proposition in standard terms for investing in nature? So integrated valuation of ecosystem services to society and trade-offs. Everything's got trade-offs. It was designed for accessibility and actionability, and still got work in some ways to go, but it's been taken up all over the world, and in most countries today. It's got hundreds, probably thousands of contributors. I was trying to think it through and make quick additions, so that's a conservative estimate. It's a way to get your own research into impact, depending on who you are and what you're up to. It's available for free, and it's open source. A lot of that is for credibility, for legitimacy globally, and it's also for that accessibility, just to get going and give people access everywhere. It's available in English, Chinese, and Spanish, and we've set it up now so we could translate into other languages if we had someone willing to really dive in with the technical language needed. And the way it works is through the idea of production functions, so we're getting right at the heart of economics. and looking at how a change, in management or policy, a shift, say, to green agriculture, what that involves in actual stewardship and revitalizing nature on land. So maybe increasing the amount of forest or other non-crop vegetation in an area, and that would change ecosystem function. So you're changing the stock, in a way, of nature on the land, in the forest, say, and the flow of benefits through functions and then services that benefit people. So the flow of water, the flux of sediments, of nutrients that you don't want to be drinking, and so on. And it will change agricultural yield by helping to retain soil and nutrient actually where it belongs, on the fields, lowering treatment costs, the number of people affected, and so on. So that's the structure. We've set up lots of different models, and about 25 to 30 are now available. They take a lot of support, data from across the world, so that you can apply them anywhere. So we're sometimes changing them out and building them up more. But if you have suggestions on models we need, please say. And I'm just going to show a couple of slides to emphasize that they're all based ultimately on empirical work. That means being out in the real world, out in nature. This is in Costa Rica, where there is the question, why save rainforest? How do you answer that? How did they achieve the turnaround? No other country has achieved anything like that in the tropics, going from such heavy deforestation to reforestation in a few decades. And here's one answer. It's pollination. In 1 week, the coffee blooms only for a week. So this picture on the upper left, can you hear me if I step back? Okay. Shows coffee blooming. It looks like popcorn exploding across a really verdant landscape. And the bees have to fly like hell to pollinate those flowers in the 1 week and satisfy. How many had coffee today? I had several cups. And then 9 months later, it turns into these lovely berries that run our lives, and picked by many people and sent into vast supply chains all around the world. Huge, millions and millions of people benefit through coffee, work in the coffee system. But how much does coffee depend on pollination? The then student here, Taylor Ricketts, who now runs a major institute at Vermont, he set up a wonderful study looking, this was before we even had ArcGIS and stuff, just a photograph of some satellite, and actually these were air photos of landscape with forest and then coffee farms where there was no forest. And we set up sites thinking that, well, bees are smart. They're not going to fly any distance. They're going to optimize their foraging. So they might fly out some halo around forests, might get good bee pollination services, because they depend on forests the 51 other weeks of the year. That's where the flowers, the nectar, and pollen are, and that's what bees mostly think about, nectar and pollen. I'm told with my psychological studies of them. And so we, measured the pollination rates, and it was more complicated than you can imagine doing this properly, and took a good amount of effort. We nearly went blind. Just guess how many different bee species fly around in a typical farm in a nice, rich agricultural area with nature around. Anybody want to throw out a number? We found over 1,000 different types of bee, never mind the numbers of bee. Which ones are making the big difference? Where do they come from? How can we sustain them across the landscape? In any case, we only answered some of those mysteries, but found out there's more pollination in that halo, 20% higher yields in there. That translated, in the context of this one farm, to a $60,000 per year yield boost. So that's real money. And we then, there's also a 50% increase in quality, but at that time there was no separation of beans by quality, so we didn't value it economically, but that was significant. We then looked at pest control. This is your last one, just to get you into how to measure these things. And now there are tons of studies like this, and they've been, building for many decades now. But we went out, looked at bats in the middle of the night, and at all kinds of other things, birds, especially attacking this coffee berry borer, this little beetle that sets up shop in the beans and ruins them and destroys yield. Caught all kinds of beauties out in the farms that you would never think, if you had coffee today, that one of these birds, this royal flycatcher, that's the male, here's the female, might have helped provide that coffee to you. And they're hungry, and they're very active. They have opinions, as you can see here. And bats. This is the largest bat in the neotropics, and it's the largest carnivorous bat in the world, spectral's bat. And it goes around eating the birds. So it's a whole system, and you've got to get your way into the system to really understand and then put in the models that economists could use to help value a marginal increase in the amount of forest around farms for livelihood security and production of coffee. So we went out, and this wonderful former student, Danny Karp, who now runs a big center at UC Davis, set up these exclosures around many coffee shrubs, and also had to do this for a year. Every morning at dawn and every evening at dusk, a whole squadron of people on little motorcycles went out and raised or lowered these, the walls of these exclosures. You can see a bunch of them here. Some excluding just birds, so they were lowered in the day so birds couldn't get in. But they were opened at night, letting bats in. So that sort of thing, without going through it all, excluding either birds or bats or both, and then a control. And running this for about a year at different distances from forest. So here's coffee growing right next to forest. In some places, the nearest forest is kilometers away. So did that, and at the end of it all, a couple years later, found out that, coffee berry borer infestation, the biggest pest on coffee in the world, went down by 50% if you were near forest. And who knows that? Farmers were laughing their heads at us. We'd worked there for many years. We've hired many of them onto our teams, but they never thought this was going to bear fruit, so to speak. But it bore a lot of fruit. The bats were a more complicated story. That was thanks to birds. The bats are really complex. They gobble up some of the helpful insects as well as some of the harmful ones. But all of this kind of empirical work is what goes into the modeling. The modeling through INVEST can happen at different scales. For ITBES, for example, Becky Chaplin-Kramer, who's playing a lead role in ITBES coming up, really led with a bunch of other people in a very extended team, modeling of food security, water purification, pollination, and coastal resilience around the world in lots of different ITBES scenarios for that first report. China used all this in their zoning of the whole country that I'll get into in a minute, and they've contributed a ton to the modeling, are developing new ones as we speak for sandstorm control, a bigger problem with shifts in winds and also with critical minerals mining, opening up a lot of sand. With Belize, that we'll get into more in a minute, but coastal zone management, integrating across many sectors around the world, shipping, near shore, boating for tourism, just recreational boating and snorkeling and that kind of thing, fishing for lobster, for a number of other fine and expensive products in fishing industry, for recreation, for coastal protection. They're operating with a 20-year development plan with major goals for growth and want to secure nature, especially on coastlines, in a way to allow that growth to happen and protect it and people. And then finally, Morgan Stanley, which I think I'll show tomorrow in the lightning talk, but working on revealing for any corporate asset whose location we know, what its dependence and impacts are on nature. So So these are just examples. Here's some of the modeling. I'm going to speed on and just give you now a couple of examples of engaging with partners at a project scale, a demonstration sort of scale, and then remind you that we're wondering how are we going to scale this all up much more, really mainstream, and make visible nature in policy and finance in all of our minds. If nature, like the role of bees, birds, and bats, isn't even in the minds of all the farmers out in fields in Costa Rica. Sorry, could I pester you for a glass of water? Thank you. You know, how will it be in all of our minds here in London or in the UK, elsewhere? We need to work on this and kind of get back to nature. Thank you so much. So speaking of water, here's an effort building on the New York example to, in Quito and all parts of, actually, Ecuador and Colombia really got going on this. I have to say, just to give hints as to why some of these things really take off and others don't, a couple people married one another and have a really happy marriage. An Ecuadorian and a Costa Rican, and a Colombian, and have, you know, when one country wasn't doing so well, they shift over to the other and really power up excitement, understanding, and investment in water security for cities, for food production, for hydropower energy. So here it all hinges on where the water comes from. We're good at not thinking about that. Most people where I live have no idea where the water comes from. We're lucky, right at my university in California, it comes from a national park, Yosemite, which probably some of you have visited. But most people are drinking polluted groundwater and suffering with the health consequences of that around Silicon Valley and all the stuff that's been dumped into groundwater supplies. But anyhow, here, it's about reaching across many divides, these many different sectors, coming together in a way through a secretariat to invest upstream in people who speak Quechua and don't like speaking Spanish so much or trust those downstream. Lots of things to span in culture, in our psychology, as well as in financial systems and water supply systems. But what we helped with was targeting investments, using Invest. Which sorts of activities? Should it be just fencing livestock out or actually replanting forest? Would that really pay off? What's the return on investment in that intervention? Versus protecting remaining forest in the upper, typically the steepest reaches of watersheds. And where over these vast regions that feed the downstream consumers of the water would we put these investments? Without some kind of modeling system, you would have, it would be sheer guesswork. New York has a pretty small watershed that's close to the city, so it was a lot of logic, went a long way there. But that's what inspired development of these models. And all along, this is the Cauca Valley in Colombia. You can see all these purple blobs are watersheds. The one at the top is for a city called Tuluá with a few 100,000 people. And this is what the stream network looks like, tipping that watershed. So the top shows in green where there's existing forest still. The rest has been deforested. Where are you going to do what? And there is an investment portfolio of protection, reforestation, silvopasture, fencing, and enriching by bringing in more native understory plants. And it's a package, that's the intervention. And this analysis shows where it would pay off and what it would yield. In this case, water quality. How much would water quality improve over some years for those plants to grow and benefit people downstream under different budget levels? So it might sound complex, but it's amazing how many of these have gotten off the ground. Thanks to the leadership, particularly of Luis Alberto Moreno, at the IDB, the Inter-American Development Bank. We developed a simpler part of Invest called Rios that just focus specifically on these questions and help develop this standardized approach of science, financing, and governance that's now been established in 55 water funds across Latin America. Many of the capital cities, it's big places, not little towns so much, and it's growing in Africa, especially in Asia, and starting to open in the hydropower sector. So, long way to go still, but that's a win. Here's another one in coastal climate resilience. I often pay attention to the weather over here. I have so many friends here or on the continent. I don't know if you do that. I also pay attention to the weather in the Caribbean. There's so many devastating storms that come in and hit those poor islands, low-lying, very vulnerable. And it's all caused by a few big emitters. And the damages are really hard to summarize just in economic terms. But these are some recent damages. And we've been invited to develop the software to help places illuminate where they would best invest to restore seagrass beds. I never thought those little seagrasses did much. They do a heck of a lot in reducing how high and how forcefully waves go up onto the land in big storms. And especially if you have mangroves and coral reefs, that adds a lot more protection. So this is just a window into the software so you can kind of imagine how it works with different scenarios relating to sea level rise and exposure, amount of nature, and then ability to put it in. And the vulnerable places are not where you'd think. No one's standing out there on these islands. It's not that obvious where the risk is. And I don't have time to get into it all. Many of you are probably expert in this, but the software is very helpful. And it led back in 2016 to this integrated coastal zone management plan across all those sectors, including even oil and gas drilling. How to make space to protect the remaining ecosystems in the area and really expand them to support the 20-year development vision of the country. IDB really supported this, liked the outcome, and then helped scale it across all member countries, this type of approach. So that's another kind of win. And the third big one I want to mention, way too briefly for what it is China. It's astonishing to see how many of you work in China or follow what they're doing on nature positive development. I'd love to meet you and chat at some point if there's time, maybe tomorrow. I've worked there for nearly 20 years now, and I've never could have imagined seeing what has changed. It's been unbelievable. And I know you had a huge role in that. So on the nature side, now, after many smaller demonstrations, but small being massive in scale by most standards, they've zoned 54% of their land for regenerating nature, 54%. So people live on a lot of that land. They don't throw people off. They are in a few limited instances, like with pandas and some other very sensitive biodiversity, but making livelihoods just outside those sensitive areas. Or with the South to North Water Transfer Project, where they really want that water to arrive reliably and relatively clean. But in general, people are there. It's all about stewardship, and about 200 million people are being paid for stewardship of different sorts to deliver on. These are the top 5 high-level goals: flood control, biodiversity, sandstorm control, water purification, and just water supply and flood control. And then within each county, they do these 5-year plans where they list out all their other goals. And I'm going to touch on basically 2 more things and draw to a close so we can open and have conversation with everyone. A major advance that China is just playing around with, and that a bunch of other countries are experimenting with, is a way of reflecting the degree to which investing in nature will propel growth in a high-level metric that could go alongside GDP maybe alongside the Human Development Index as well, to reflect the things we might really focus on if we limit ourselves to a few metrics. And GEP is set up, is structured in parallel to GDP. It's basically the total value from goods and services produced by ecosystems over, say, a year's time period. And it's in development. So obviously GDP had some decades to develop and mature in its implementation. So it's maturing right now. We have added quite a lot of services, including in parentheses there, mental health. We're about to release a mental health model that has involved a lot of empirical testing, as well as many groups testing and summaries in the literature and such. But strong for people living in cities, and how many of us live in cities today and in the future, for school kid performance, for all kinds of dimensions of cognitive functioning and emotional well-being. Just being in touch with a small amount of nature can make a world of difference. And so we're thrilled to be able to add that. But it basically reveals where the values are, how much benefit is produced and contributed to human society, and who actually enjoys the benefit, the distributional, equity-related questions. And using a lot of remote sensing, a lot of data coming in from all over, and we're getting more and more of that for any place in the world now. It reveals basically the contribution of ecosystems to the economy and society. It allows and guides financial compensation from receiving areas to supply areas, and that's partly how the 200 million plus people are being paid. And it lets you track performance of policies, of leaders, of investments. So some of the development banks and other investors are now using it in performance-linked bonds or loans. It's just a nice metric. It can be used at a lot of different scales, from very small area. China's got banks giving out loans to people who will support projects that enhance GEP at lower rates. So it was approved by the UN back in 2021, and there are about 15 countries playing around with it seriously now, including Italy and Sweden and some other places in Europe, as well as across the world regions. And the last thing, I'm going to skip ahead on some slides, is just to get to the point of, well, where are we as a community? How can we go much farther than this? And you're going to see me skip over a crazy number of slides in a second. But basically, what I want to say is the MDBs came together back at COP26 and pledged to transform how they support development, how they define it, how they finance it, how they support countries in achieving it, and they are mainstreaming nature. And we're working with the three biggest. We've had people on our team seconded at the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the Asian Development Bank for long periods, really learning their systems and trying to bring our science into their systems. We need to do this much, much more. That's mainly my closing message. This was an arc through one thin thread that can help inspire, achieve some outcomes, and inspire and maybe promote replication. But we have to go so much further, and I'm sure you're all on your own threads trying to find the pathways. And I want to highlight someone. I think her father might be here, and I see him smiling out there. She's busy taking an exam now, a master's student here at the LSE. Sofia Roca really helped get all this going in Chile. It's incredible. I encourage you to reach out and meet her. How one person, she won our inaugural Natural Capital Young Leaders Prize. One person can make such a difference. Obviously working with others, but just with commitment and resolve and the type of patience to really try to understand others, befriend others, develop depth in what they do and what they're up against. And if we can come together more through the wonderful initiatives that I know Nicola is going to reveal a bit more about to everyone here. There's so many things we could team up and do together across the people in the room here now and across the world. And one innovation in Chile was developing this committee that sat above. It involved initially the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Economy, Development, and Tourism, and the Ministry of Environment. Once that strange combo got together, everybody wanted to be involved, and every ministry fought to be part of the committee. And all kinds of watershed and forest management improved, and a really integrated approach was advanced. And there's stories everywhere. Chile was one of 15 countries that we worked with in one shot, trying to develop cohorts selected by the MDBs. The countries had to kind of apply, and they were selected. We're now getting a second, set through hopefully the UN Development Program of 15 SIDS, the low-lying island states. And we're hoping to drive a portfolio approach that lets us go farther and faster. And now I'm just going to close with one last thing. I'd say this idea of valuing nature, it's an idea whose time has come. And as we all remember in the famous quote of Victor Hugo, nothing is as powerful as an idea whose time has come. But we need to do a lot to bring it to life. And what we'll focus on through the Natural Capital Alliance, we're kind of deciding we're more than a project after 20 years, is mainly supporting capacity development. There's so much more demand around the world in developed as well as developing countries to deploy these approaches, and not nearly enough skilled people in the ideas, in the tools, in kind of all the different steps. And so we're launching a technical assistance center, and we aim to focus primarily on government and public sector funding, but we've worked a lot, and can talk later, and I will a little bit tomorrow, about private sector. We've done a lot with the private sector, but never figured out how to scale. And I think here in London, this is an opportunity really ripe and very inspiring to advance scaling across the private sector. And the last thing I want to say is that we don't want to lose heart in any sense here in what's going on politically, or we don't want to lose heart for nature. And I realize that a lot of this work has gotten fairly technical, and when trying to describe it quickly, I get into the technical detail. But one time I went, it was in December of 22, to the meeting of European central bank heads, and it was in Latvia, in Riga, by the Baltic, and I got myself into a panic, which is a typical thing, and I thought, how am I going to talk with these central bankers? I don't even know how they talk. And I spent a lot of time trying to learn the lingo, reading all these reports, and I was panicked when I got there, and then I met this guy who was meant to be my host in Latvia, and he greeted me as we came into the first formal dinner, and he said, now listen, I know you're a scientist, but let me tell you, whatever you do not talk about the technical sides of valuing nature. No one invited you here for that. I was shocked, and I'm like, oh my God, what was I invited here for? And he said, people want you to talk about what you know about nature. They want to hear, that's what they want to hear about. What they care about is nature. And the whole evening was spent with different central bankers standing up and talking about what nature meant to them when they grew up with their grandparents, thinking about their kids and their own grandkids. we don't want to lose that heart either. And so with that, I'm really grateful, really excited, and really looking forward to seeing what we can do together in the time ahead. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Gretchen. I think that last set of comments about what it means to us individually certainly resonates for me, and we think about why we do what we do. That's a great deal of it. I think the other one that resonated for me was that individuals matter, and you clearly have made a difference. And the things that you've introduced, not just this evening, but in your career, in the structures that you've created, I think all of us can take heart that we can make a difference. It's not just in the collective or somebody else out there. I think we all have power and capacity, and I think you've demonstrated that. So really thank you again for your talk, and really interesting. I want to next introduce Nicola Ranger, who is a professor here at LSE. Among other things that I'm really pleased to let you all know is that Nicola, among other things, is the theme lead for nature and biodiversity for our new Global School on Sustainability. So I get a chance to work with her in some greater length. I won't spend a lot of time talking about the work that she's doing. There's an enormous amount of intersection with some of the things that Gretchen's just talked about. Ways that we value nature, how do we think about the economics, how do we link it back into the banking sector, into the communities of practice that we work with and on, and that's so much part of the ecosystems of governance and society that we live with. So without further ado, Nicola, I turn it to you to introduce the panel. Your microphone.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you so much, Gretchen, for such an inspiring talk. It really was. But maybe just to sort of a few comments to sort of bring us from here into this fantastic discussion that we'll have now. And all of my work and our work here in Earth Capital Nexus is about sort of bringing all the science and really making it relevant from a financial and economic perspective. So really sort of trying to, in similar way to Gretchen mentioned, is how do we take all of this knowledge but put it in the terms that financial and economic decision makers need to really sort of encode it into how we think about public spending, how financial institutions are allocating their investments. And whenever I start one of my speeches in this area, I often start with talking to financial institutions or corporates. This isn't about birds and bees and butterflies. This is about the economics. But I think, Gretchen, you've really shown today that actually it is about the birds and bees and butterflies and the bats as well. And really sort of, made that point really clear. And I think, thank you so much for doing that. Without further ado, I want to introduce our wonderful panel to sort of take us forward now. So firstly, I'm going to introduce all three and then sort of start the discussion. Firstly, it's an honour to introduce Professor Siddhartha Dasgupta, Emeritus Professor at the University of Cambridge of Economics and author of the landmark Dasgupta Review in 2021. Then to Maria Fryer, who is Head of Sustainability at Barclays and will be bringing our financial sector perspective to the discussion. And finally to Professor Giles Atkinson, my co-lead on nature, my boss as Interim Director of the Grantham Research Institute and Professor of Environmental Policy here at the LSE. Thank you. So, into the discussion. So first I want to come to you, Partha, if I may. Your landmark report in 2021 really sort of laid out the economics of why we need to bring biodiversity into decision making and the importance of this issue from an economic perspective. 5 years on from there, are you seeing nature being routinely brought into decision making by ministries of finance and central banks? And if not, why not? What needs to change?
Gosh, this is a hard one. I haven't really been keeping up with government policies just as well. I keep my nose clean. So I can't. I think the book had a good reception in the following sense. I found no criticism of its analysis, absolutely none at all, for 6 years. For a good reason, there wasn't an error in it. It would have been very difficult to make an error. Nature is such a large part of us. And if you spent time, and I had a fantastic team, the Treasury team was amazing. I mean, pulled together this was during COVID period. The report was really quite inspired by them. I was made to work. I mean, I was like they were whipping me. The review was not directed at the UK government. I know it was really to rewrite economics. That's how that sounds pretentious, but it happens to be the truth. Economics is completely divorced from nature. It would be very difficult to find an article in any of the 5 top journals, even the top 10 journals over the past decades, which had nature in it in any form. And here we have had this excellent presentation looking at nature from a very focused at a particular, watersheds and so forth, because that's the tapestry. You have to weave these bits and pieces together to create the tapestry, which is what ecological economics is about. And I am talking about ecological economics. And the report that you were just review was defining ecological economics. Now, you can't really blame governments except in not having a wide enough view about the matter, because our subject is misleading. Its entire grammar is wrong. Its grammar is wrong for one thing. Very easy to see why, in what way. We are obsessed with flows. GDP is a flow. So many dollars of goods and services per year. But actually what Gretchen is pointing to in her talk was that the flows are emerging out of stocks. And economics is really about asset management. It's not, finance didn't come out of the blue. We are involved in asset management, and everybody's life, we all are asset managers. Every day of your life you're managing your assets. Whether it's your pencil or your desk or your house or these are assets, these are stocks. So we ought to really have to move from flows to stocks, and that's one of the things that I think I tried to do in the review, was to rewrite economics in terms of stock management. I think that's the right way to go about it. Gretchen's talk, I thought was superb, was concerned with the regeneration rate of a stock of natural capital, and how to improve it, how to increase it by creating a more healthy stock. The stock could be measured in quantity or quality, it doesn't matter, it depends on the context, obviously. But some amalgaming of the two. But this conference we're going to have tomorrow is about macroeconomics. I want to sort of move from the natural capital side to the macroeconomy. And there are 2 ways natural capital enters into the macroeconomic modeling. It's not very difficult to write the model down, by the way. Any of you with an economics, 1 or 2 years of economics can easily write down by just thinking and looking at the existing models of economic growth or development or whatever, and seeing how to embed nature into it and see what changes it makes. Well, there are 2 ways it enters. First of all, we harvest nature. That's the kind of activity which creates a separation between us as humans and the rest of nature, and we are of course part of it. And that's the harvesting may create some psychological distance between ourselves as humans and the rest of the biosphere. And that's, I think, that's where some of the psychological stresses come up. Because if it's external, you're like fishing, taking it out. The fishery is separate from us. There's a second, which I think is much deeper, and it can also be modeled, is that it's in some sense we are embedded in it. So the stock enters in, if you like, in an economic model through total productivity. So if the stock declines, then the entire infrastructure on the basis of which our economy rests declines. So, and there's a tension between the two. The more you harvest, you need it for a variety of purposes. the more pressure you're imposing on the stock, the natural capital stock. It may not affect the regeneration rate, which is contrary to what Gretchen's was about how to keep up the regeneration rate by improving the stock, how to make it more productive as an asset. But it could be that the asset is declining in quality or quantity because you're taking too much out of it. And of course that rebounds because if the stock is part of your total factor productivity of your output, then it feeds back to reducing that. Intuitively, that's pretty clear what's going on. Because nature is serving two purposes here. One as an input to production, and the other as a sort of a blanket on which production takes place, and that can be threatened. I think it's that tension that we face throughout. And I think decision makers, when we worry about their decision-making processes, it's that they don't see the connection between the two, and that they focus on the former, the harvesting part of it, not recognizing. Now, when I say they're not recognizing, our institutions are bad at recognizing that. One reason, of course, is, I would say that, wouldn't I? I'm an economist. There's a lot of missing markets, lots of missing prices. Now, when I say prices, I don't necessarily mean market prices. I mean, when I say price of a thing, it bites you when you touch it. So if there's a quota on something, or a ration, or a social convention of not taking more out of something, there is an implicit price in what you do. So when I use the word price, please don't think that I'm trying to make it into a market statement. We have found ways of avoiding having to create markets, all for the good in many ways, because it brings in other benefits. So I think this is where the problem arises, in that the fact that it affects total factor productivity is less visible, less measurable, more difficult to measure. The absence of prices is one reason. And so that part of nature is missed in macroeconomic modeling, I think, as far as I can see. But it can be remedied very easily, and the notes I've supplied to you for tomorrow has a complete capital model with natural capital and produced capital, human capital, and so forth, so that the interrelationships are produced. We need to have that introduced into our macroeconomic teaching at the universities, as well as, of course, in decision making. We tend, as an old-time professor, I feel we tend to overemphasize the harm that government agencies, international bodies inflict on the rest of us by having bad models. But the source of that is, of course, ourselves, LSE, Cambridge, you name it. Because today's decision makers were yesterday's students. It's the teaching, the economics teaching is at fault. We are sitting here at the LSE, but I would be very surprised if mainstream economics courses here have much in the natural capital in it. There'll be a lot on human capital, manufactured, produced capital, but very little on natural capital. One reason, my guess, is that economists are ignorant of ecology. They don't mix with ecologists. And that disconnection, I think, is very harmful, because it's easy to talk about the regeneration rate of the ecosystem, the pictures that we saw, but to model it, to recognize that needs modeling, and that it ought to be fed into economics, it requires a certain education, which we don't have. We have the maths education, we have the statistics education, but not the ecology education. And that seems to me to be now absolutely urgent.
Thank you so much, and I can guarantee that Giles's course does include natural capital, although unfortunately all of his students are doing an exam right now. So
I'm to blame for that as well, yes, that's where Sophia is in my course.
Thank you. So I want to come on to Marie now, as our financial sector representative on the panel. So how does natural capital degradation translate into the risks that you're assessing and seeing on growth on your portfolios, but also some of the opportunities as well?
Well, first of all, I'm hugely grateful to be here, but also feel incredibly humble. I am clearly academically massively underqualified to be sitting on the stage. I studied philosophy, which I think the main thing I learned is that I don't know anything. So starting from that low base, what I think, you know, both Gretchen's presentation and what's been discussed so far resonates incredibly, because again, we're trying to quantify things. And one thing that we know, and I do hope that I can bring a bit of, as you said, additional perspective to the discussion, is that both in finance, but also in real economy corporates, which are our clients who we advise and talk to every day, if it's not in the spreadsheet, it doesn't impact the decision making, right? So we need to get into the spreadsheets. And that's whether it's an investment manager who's thinking about their portfolio, or a bank that's looking to lend, or even a corporate that's going to their board to say, we want to invest this amount of capex into some kind of adaptation facility, or whatever they want to do. And if it doesn't show up in their investment, obviously in basic terms, the risk return profile, but you know, they go to the investment committee, they have to show the numbers. So we need to think about getting into the appropriate spreadsheets, so that means we need to quantify it. So I think those are some sort of broad observations. I know we'll probably come back to where we think we can finance things and what more we can do. But one other example I wanted to share with you, sort of trying to answer your question around how relevant is it to us. We think it's enormously relevant. Obviously, some of the work that you've led together with the Green Finance Institute in terms of the potential impact on UK GDP, for example, a couple of years ago, 12%. But also the report that we saw from the UK government this week, I'm not sure who all read it, in terms of national security, obviously a topic that I'm sure is at the forefront of all of our minds at the moment, and as depressing as it might be that we have to think of it in that context now, it obviously raises awareness, and I think it raises the sort of sense of pressure as well. So we've invested a lot of time in it in the last couple of years. What does that mean as a bank? So obviously there's always the risk on the opportunity side. What we decided to do is get a whole team looking at the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, to look at the LEAP assessment that they recommend, and pick a couple of client portfolios. They were static, so they were not necessarily current. And so we said we look at our power clients, power and utilities, and we'd look at the mining sector, and we take those, and then we try to do that. And initially everyone said, oh, it's too hard, you can't do it. And it did start with looking at over 100 data providers and actually passing through who we thought was most credible. So that alone takes I don't know how many weeks. And then actually trying to marry those data sets to come up with something that we thought was vaguely credible. Then we went to our risk colleagues, and they obviously every day we have a climate risk specific department, but they're broadly thinking every day about how they assess our corporate clients against financial risks, right? And that could be obviously all sorts of different dimensions, but increasingly also climate risk, and now from a nature perspective. And they developed 6 scenarios looking at completely typical both physical and transition nature or natural risk type factors. So it could go all the way from storm surge, other water-related risks, but also looking at policy risk. And so, for example, water policy, what could that mean for these potential companies? And then do that and model it. And indeed, on a cumulative basis over 5 years, we came up with earnings impacts that were for, I'm going to get the wrong way around, but for the mining sector, I think it was going to be around 25%, and in the power sector over 10%. I mean, again, we didn't even factor in the mitigation that these companies were already undertaking, and I was very nervous around false accuracy, but we have to start somewhere. And so the upshot of all that was a white paper that we put out in September to really share our findings with both the investor community and our corporate clients. And the response was really great. So I'll tell you, we had some stakeholders who were very concerned, who thought that if we go and start talking to our clients about this, that they might feel attacked or criticized. And of course, as you all know, they're all already thinking about this anyway. And so actually welcome the dialogue and welcome the discussion to say, okay, as our bank who's lending to us, how are you thinking about this? And how are you quantifying these risks? Are you giving us the credit for the mitigation efforts we're already making? What are you looking at next? So very constructive conversations, and similarly in the investment community, who were just like, okay, this is really encouraging. It might not be perfect, and I guess that would be my final sort of where I got to. It's enough to get going, and that for us is hugely critical.
Thank you. I want to come now to Giles, so sort of coming back into the economics, and one of the tools that we've all been thinking about, how do we use better, is the natural capital accounting that you mentioned, Gretchen, and so we've been talking to a number of corporates and financial institutions about how do you bring all of that knowledge more into the spreadsheets that you laid out. So Giles, natural capital accounting has been around for a long time. Is it making a difference? Is it changing decision making? in your experience?
Gosh, well, actually, I think Gretchen's outlining for us about the ecosystem product just shows sort of really exciting innovations and progress, because you seem to have decision making kind of embedded in the whole point of doing that. And I have been around this work on natural capital accounting for a lot of that time. I guess what I would say is actually the bit that we now call wealth accounting, yes, that's been around a long while, since the mid-1990s. Natural capital accounting is probably a bit more new, 10 to 15 years, so it depends on what you call long, I suppose. My interests have mostly been in the context of the national accounting scene, so I'm going to speak mostly to that. And I think the great promise of that work essentially is it provides that statistical infrastructure that you need for decision making, and it does that in a way where you have a framework that you can measure things consistently, you can replicate it on a year-to-year basis. So it's there's real promise there, and I think that the work of Partha shows us how that changing wealth and changing natural capital feeds into thinking about whether development is sustainable or not. Has that been realised in practice in the official work that's been done in statistical offices and policy departments? Well, I think it's a glass half full, half empty. I think that the half empty bit of the glass is that it needs time and money to do this work, and I think we have to be realistic. A lot of countries don't even have balance sheets, or they have balance sheets which are very narrow, so we're not even doing the basic wealth accounting without adding on the natural capital bit. So the question maybe is for me not so much has an influence, but why aren't we doing more of this work? Because it's the basic ingredient that we need for these decisions. There definitely is an extra bit, which is how you make sure that those accounts are useful for policy thinking and decision making. And I think that's where the glass is half full, because I think you can find examples where breakthroughs have happened, where we can learn from what succeeded, and actually you see a lot of impressive achievement. So I think what you need the political commitment to building that natural capital evidence base. I think as well you need institutional dialogue between the data provider, so the statistical office, and the policy ministries, and I think that didn't happen necessarily during the 1990s. So we had a little bit of a false start. So the progress has been more recently. So quickly, the example that I would give on that is it's actually the UK context. It's just one example, and I think it starts with the United Kingdom, its national ecosystem assessment around about 2010. But the developments that sort of came in the wake of that, the Natural Capital Committee in the UK, the Natural Capital Accounting Programme, which was implemented by the Office for National Statistics. I think crucially there, the big change compared to when that work was started in the 1990s was the policy dialogue that went on between the Office for National Statistics, the Natural Capital Committee, and importantly, the Department for Environment as well. That was the big difference and the kind of like game changer. So you can see it feeding in then to the 25-year plan and the subsequent policies. So I think there are these success stories, and I think Gretchen kind of added to that as well with the gross ecosystem product, which sounds incredible.
I'd like to make a connection. There are students here, so it's useful. You alluded to wealth accounts, and that's exactly right. You're looking at the stock of assets that you have, and you try and value that with whatever techniques you have. The question is, why do you wish to value the stocks? In particular, why should we be interested in inclusive wealth? In wealth now, including all types of capital assets, all the capital assets, not just produced capital and human capital, but natural capital as well. And the reason is there is a deep connection between wealth and welfare. You can show that the two are mirror images of one a comprehensive notion of wealth, that is, and intertemporal welfare. Welfare, not just today's welfare, but tomorrow's, day after, and so forth. Your conception of intertemporal welfare. The two are intrinsically connected. If one goes up, the other goes up, and if one goes down, the other goes down. It's an equivalence result. And that's why we're interested in wealth, not because it sounds grand. It's just that there is a deep connection between wealth, which flow accounts will not give you. It's extremely important to remember that, because flows can't tell you anything about the future, by definition. It's stocks that can. So you shouldn't be surprised that wealth is doing the job that you would ideally want an economic measure to convey. And the sooner we move to, if you like, balance sheets and wealth accounts, the better it will be, because you can then check which assets are under threat, which ones are not. And Gretchen's lecture was really all about that. How do you protect a particular asset, which he was studying?
I want to, so we've into our last 5 minutes. I want to give you a chance to ask a few questions. So have a think about your question. While you're thinking about your question, I want to come back to the tantalising point that Marie made about how do we get finance into this area, and give you an opportunity to tell us the answer to that, Marie.
It's really hard.
And then while you're telling us the answer, hands up, and then I'll come to you for a couple of questions.
Okay, let me try and do this in a shorter version. We talk about the massive financing gap, right? 700 billion a year. I mean, I don't even know what that number really means. Right? So it's great to think in terms of galvanizing the energy, but what we really need is a pipeline of investable opportunities, and they could be twofold. Of course, the truth is that a lot of these things are sort of project level, and they accrue, the benefits accrue to a broad range of stakeholders. So if you're reflooding an area to protect somewhere downstream, there'll be several corporates, there'll be some communities, et cetera, et cetera. So on the one hand, you could say that's great, but you somehow need to bundle that benefit, that return on the asset, on the infrastructure, whatever you want to call it, in a way that allows you to create a revenue stream that allows you to create that financing, right? Because you need to service that whatever debt, presumably a debt kind of product that's going to be. So either you need to have a broad set of beneficiaries and you bundle the benefits to them, or you need to start stacking the revenues from that particular project in a way that allows you to create something. So those things are technical, they're really hard. Our colleagues and others are really staring hard at that problem. In particular, then, can we create blended finance structures, which we all talk about a huge amount, both in the context of climate and nature, but actually in practice really hard to do. And so everyone is talking about innovative finance, and then ask people, what do you mean? Show me one that's worked. And we've had very few actually work. We're very excited about the TFFF, the Tropical Forest Forever Fund that was launched by the Brazilian government at COP30. So we're leaning in heavily to try and lend some of our structuring and other advisory capabilities to get that off the ground and work with more of the governments. And folks are interested, well worth reading up on. Is that one of those that could work? And then quickly I want to mention on the other side, what we shouldn't forget, aside from the restoration, which of course we need to do, are also investments to stop further degradation. And so thinking about, for us, slightly easier to do, but business propositions, for example, water or other resource management, water filtering, recycling, alternatives to pets, right? So really thinking about individual business models that are, from a demand perspective, shifting demand to more sustainable consumption patterns or otherwise. And those might be easier, because you could say, oh, here's a business model, it can replace, say, PET in bottles, it's actually economically, as in like, there wouldn't be a higher price, or at least one that the consumer would pay, all of a sudden it's in your spreadsheet, the investment, hopefully the investment case works, but getting those to the point where they are feasible and scalable, again, is something that we're working on. There's one for bees, to stop to protect the colonies better. There's all sorts of really great innovation that's happening. That's the other way, I think, to go. So projects and innovative solutions.
Fantastic. Excellent. So let's have 3 quick questions. Sorry, we don't have time for more, but 3 quick ones, and then we'll come around to the panel to answer those, and then wrap up. I think there's a lady in the red glasses I'm going to come to, the gentleman in the back in the beige coat, and then here at the side.
Thank you, and great talk. Thank you for your time. So this is one perhaps to address to Gretchen and Giles in the case of China and their ability to do actually the stocks accounts. And in comparison to democracies, is there something at play in terms of China being able to have this long-term vision, long-term strategies, versus democracies sort of having the situation where the benefits might be reaped by subsequent administrations? So a question on how is China looking at these? I saw China in your example, Gretchen, and maybe Gals, if this example is actually dripping down into the real national capital accounting public policy conversation.
Oh, no, I think you should.
But let's take the three,
Okay,
and
sure.
then we can answer it.
Sort of following on from that question, particularly given the examples Gretchen named in China and in Costa Rica, we're talking cohesive, comprehensive state action for mass restoration or arresting decline. Where's the relative emphasis on public finance? And where's the Treasury official or the Bank of England official on the panel?
Finally?
Thank you. Thanks for an inspiring talk. I work at the Office for National Statistics on natural capital accounting, so I'm very happy to hear that we have been taken as an example of success. I have to say, my glass is still half empty because I think it's still not enough what we see in terms of the impact of our statistics on real decision making. And it will be very interesting for me to hear what ingredients make the success in countries where perhaps you have observed more of that direct impact. Thank you.
Gretchen, would you like to start? And maybe we'll...
Sure, I'll start, I think, on the China question. That's the kind of thing that plays through my mind all the time. You know, what are the ingredients of success, and what mix of ingredients will be enough to lift a country or a region, you know, whatever the unit is. And I say that if I had gone on the further slides, and you could look on the NatCap website, we'll have more that we're writing up now. We're just finishing this project. The idea was sort of 16 countries in 16 months. They're very variable. The example I was going to give was of Philippines. And it's a huge country. We don't tend to think about it in terms of high capacity, but they made a massive lift, introducing a law that would allow them to protect kind of the natural capital serving water supply, basically. A lot of rivers, they have a lot of flooding and great incentive to focus on this, but for millennia they haven't really, or for a lot of recent history at least. So I'd say there's a chance anywhere. In China, it's not only that you have Xi Jinping, who is personally, I've heard from many people who know, I'm not one who would know directly, but deeply committed and believes people are an intimate part of nature, not something separate, and that his biggest legacy in many ways will be rescuing nature and maybe the planet to some degree, if some of the positive influences he has on the energy transition and other things play out. But China also has many other things in its favor, like a lot of very well-trained sort of scientists and engineers making decisions at various levels in government, so it's easy there's a high capacity for this kind of thing. They've also experienced real extremes. I don't know how many have traveled extensively in China, but in recent years, say it more than a decade ago now, or about a decade ago, I used to go a lot up until the pandemic time, and you couldn't see your hand in front of your face with the air pollution, and that was just the tip of the iceberg in terms of problems. So they've paid a very steep price, and there's a motivation and understanding that comes from, there's a Confucius saying, maybe I can wrap up with that. It was something like, I might not remember well enough. I'll share it with you all later if I think of it. It's quite a long one, but it's a very apt description of how we learn. And the best teacher is bitter experience, and we're trying to avoid bitter experience by imitation rather than by actually tasting trouble oneself.
Giles, would you like to?
Yeah, it sounds like a great idea for a paper, a kind of stocktake of what determines which countries are laggards or in the vanguard here. And I think one thing is that actually that sometimes that chops and changes over the years. And I think that this sort of relates to my response to your question about whether the glass is half full or empty at the Office for National Statistics. Because actually my other point about that example is that the UK was starting from practically zero at that time. I mean, it's hard to imagine now, and there was this ambition to assume a leadership role, which I thought at the time was wishful thinking. So I was surprised at the progress which was made. So I think that there's always more that can be done. But I think neither should we be too harsh, because I think that, the progress was genuine in sort of meeting at least some of that ambition. That I must admit at that time I was sceptical as well.
Arthur, final remark?
Well, the related issue crops up in what kind of international statistics we should ask for when we ask questions about the progress or regress of nations. And if you look at, there are attempts at trying to estimate the distribution of wealth across nations. The World Bank has a project like that. United Nations Environment Program has a project of that sort as well. So these are early days, and these are very crude numbers, but never mind. It's better than saying zero. So that's great. And if you look at that, the correlation between growth in wealth and growth in GDP is not large. It's not negative, fortunately, but it's not large. It's not large and positive. And one reason is, of course, GDP is not taking into account the depreciation that accompanies production, and wealth will be the outcome of that depreciation. Now, one of the problems that I'm going to pose an intellectual problem to the audience as to how to capture it in our thinking and trying to. There is a natural tendency, urge on countries. If GDP is a measure of economic activity, and that gives you a lot of purchase, if nothing else, in the diplomatic front, and if you. They've been reading the newspapers recently, never mind the diplomacy, the bullying that can accompany large cash in hand, so to speak, and throw it around. So in some sense, competition, political competition across countries are going to go against what we've been discussing here, in some sense, because it's not wealth you'll be trying to accrue, but political muscle. And if that's it's not going to be saying we are very wealthy, so take us seriously. No, we have a lot of income which we can spend. So that I think there is a tension here over in international relationships too. There's a natural tendency for us to go for GDP growth, because if we don't, we'll be held back. We won't have the kind of political leverage that we might otherwise enjoy. I mean, think of China. I'm old enough to know when China was a nothing. You don't have to be very old to know that either, because it's been very recent, last 2 decades, 3 decades or so. It has given them huge muscular power in the diplomatic front. And so I think everything we are concerned with here, in some sense, is pressed again another front, which is the natural tendency of us to go for GDP growth against asset.
I guess I'm coming at it from a slightly different perspective again. Maybe there are people in the room who we need you, so come into finance or into the space and take these theories and all your learning and apply it and help us solve that innovative finance problem that I mentioned. We're making some progress, but we need more people who are bringing these, not the ecologist and the finance knowledge together. So come and find us and help us.
I mean, maybe just a very brief point on the question about why don't we have central banks and ministries of finance on the stage as well? And I think that actually central banks and ministries of finance are doing a lot internationally. So we work with both, and I actually started my day with the ECB this morning, talking to the European Commission about this topic. And Irena Hemskirk, who's the head of climate change for the ECB, made this beautiful statement, and I asked her if I could say it actually, because I thought it was brilliant, and it was just so clear. As protecting nature is at the centre of making Europe safer, stronger, and more sustainable. So the central banks and ministries of finance are really getting this, I think. And I hand over now to Jonathan to wrap us up.
So it's very hard to wrap up a panel like this, but let me start off by thanking them. Gretchen in particular for that really extraordinary talk. Nicola, for you and the panel for the insights that you brought to the table. So I think a really warm round of applause just for all of it. Thank you all very much for coming. There's a quote that I just want to close with, which I heard quite a number of years ago, which I have found remarkably prescient and really speaks to this moment. And it says, the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. And if you think about it that way, this was a panel that spoke explicitly to how we understand that, how we implement that, how we think about the next steps that come from that kind of an assessment. Because frankly, without the environment, our economies don't exist. And we're all here to think about welfare and improvements of livelihoods and lives, and we're all doing it in various ways. And this was a panel that gave us a lot of insight. It's also going to be some subsequent follow-up. Nicola's got some ideas for some things that might come along after some additional work. We'll be seeing some of that in March. We'll come back to all of you with some announcements of some of these next steps. And of course, the New Global School of Sustainability is anxious to bring you all in. So we'll look forward to having some of these dialogues going forward. So thank you all so much for coming. Thanks again to the panel, and have a really good evening.